This discussion is going to center on periodization. We're going to look at linear and nonlinear and a couple other forms of periodization. This is just to start to give you an idea as to how you sort of start to plan and outline long-term programming for your athletes. So this will kind of look at how we kind of divide up the year and start to consider how you kind of program the various exercise variables. The strength work, the running work, will all start to fit into these different types of periodization models. So what we're looking at here are the different cycles and periods that you have, and really you have this with any form of periodization. You have your macro cycle. So your macro cycle is your training, in most cases, 1 year of training. However, when you look at Olympic sports, their macro cycle is 4 years. Now, unique to Olympic sports is the fact that one, they have a macro cycle of 4 years, but in addition to that, they have to factor within those 4 years, there's going to be other competitions they have to prepare for. So that's something that has to be taken into consideration with those athletes. The mesocycle goes from weeks to months. Typically, in most instances, you look at a mesocycle being about 3 to 4 weeks. Again, it can go a little bit longer, but that's the typical time frame for mesocycles. Your microcycles are about 1 to 2 weeks. That's the shortest period. So basically, like a typical training week would be considered a microcycle. 2 weeks, depending upon how long or how you basically break up your days. Key with this is looking at different program design variables, and we're going to discuss this later in some of the different forms of periodizations and some of the different ways that this could be manipulated. What you're going to have with all of your cycles and periods is you're going to have the obvious preparatory phase. Then what you'll have is typically between the preparation and competition phase, you're going to have a transition. So there's actually typically 2 transitions over the course of the year. You have the transition between the preparatory and competition, and then between the competition and the next preparatory phase. You can also have that second transition in there. And a lot of times that'll sort of vary based upon, in the case of team sports, athletes, what their role was on the team during the course of the year. So for instance, if you have an athlete who really didn't get much playing time, their primary stressor was just practice, they didn't get a lot of playing time in games, they may have a shorter transition phase, whereas your starters may have a slightly longer one, or people who are also injured. Those are things you all have to consider. The key being with all this is a balance between general prep and sport-specific work. So both of these things have to be taken into consideration over the course of these cycles. So there's an amount of general prep work, which is obviously the focus of the strength and conditioning professional, to kind of get the body to withstand the actual stressors of playing the individual sport. So this looks at the different phases of resistance training. Now, some of these percentages and set and rep schemes, again, different sources, you'll have slight different variations. For now, we'll kind of work with these. Depending upon the type of periodization you're going to use, you may do, as we'll talk about, more of a linear approach. Others will use more of a concurrent approach where all these will be worked on at the same time. What you're going to have with a lot of this, your highest volume of resistance training will be during times when there's really no competitions. Okay, so when there's limited skill practices, limited games, that's where resistance training will play a greater focus. Also, you notice here the interplay between volume and intensity. As the intensity goes up, the volume goes down when you're looking at these straight percentages. So here you have the percentages for muscle hypertrophy when the focus is just on building size of the musculature and the connective tissue, your percentages for strength, and your percentages for power. So here are the different sports seasons that we look at. So the off season is basically after the postseason, and we'll talk about what the postseason is, up until 6 weeks prior to the first contest, okay? Because at 6 weeks prior to the first contest, that's going to be then what's known as your preseason, okay? And what happens with preseason is typically you're incorporating as in the case of most team sports, you're now starting to incorporate more sport-specific practice, in some cases having multiple practice sessions a day. Then your in-season is obviously when you're starting to have competition. So in addition to the sport practices, you now also have individual competitions that are going to take place. And then the postseason comes after the final contest. So now in the instance of teams that don't make playoffs, the postseason isn't going to have any games obviously at that point in time, and we'll kind of talk about over the course of the year how you can approach that differently with your athletes. Depending on if they're sort of beat up, they have some injuries, there may be some different things you have to do in the postseason. Or in the case when you make the playoffs, you now have to consider the fact that after the regular season's over, and you're doing your in-season maintenance, that has to carry into the postseason. And depending upon the success of the individual sports team, that will kind of vary how long that time frame lasts for. Okay, so looking at linear periodization. So linear periodization simply just looks at progressive mesocycles. So basically it ends up being a long-term process of carrying out low-intensity, high-volume work to high-intensity, low-volume work. So if you think back to the percentages given in the resistance training, you would basically start out pretty much just working out purely for hypertrophy, progressing to purely power. And you would do this, and you could do this with other forms of the exercise as well, your running and everything else. So we'll talk about this a little bit more, but if you think about that, in some ways it's kind of a suboptimal way to train, and we'll discuss some of the drawbacks later on. But basically here with linear periodization, you're essentially just looking at that progressive mesocycle overload over the course of the year. Now looking at transition and competition periods, and this is really something you take into consideration for any form of periodization. It's not just for linear, but transitions basically just allow for recovery and recuperation to take place. So they're basically deload periods that kind of prevents overtraining, allows the athlete to kind of gain the benefits of the work that they put in. Typically you'll see the transitions between the off to in-season and post-season to off-season. You can also use this in between harder mesocycles. So for instance, one thing I always used to do was I typically worked a system where I did 3 weeks of training, and then there would always be a 1-week deload always within that time frame. So I did like a 3-1 approach where for 3 weeks the athletes I would load them, and then the 1 week would be kind of a deload. When you're looking at transitions from off-season to in-season and post-season to off-season, those could be anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks in time. I've discussed in other classes, and I'll talk about it in here too, some of the things I've done in the immediate post-season for athletes, particularly once their seasons are completely over, once playoffs, for instance, would be over as well, and consider that. So again, this isn't necessarily something that's just particular to linear periodization. These transition periods, and obviously the competition period is factored into any form. So what are some examples of transition activities? This isn't all-inclusive, and we'll talk about more things we could do later on, but active recovery is good. So relative rest. I tend not to like to have people not do anything. I think even at the very least, some very low intensity cardiac work. So very low heart rate, relatively speaking, 100 to 140 beats per minute. This is very good for just conditioning of the heart, in as far as changes, actual physical changes that can occur with the cardiac system. Low intensity strength training, so things just to basically stimulate the athlete, and even recreational sports are good. So it's a good idea to have the athletes still do something as opposed to not doing, so in other words, don't have them do complete rest for long periods of time. You could have complete rest days factored into the course of the week, but you don't want to do it for a long period of time. You basically want to keep them doing something during these transition times.